Right, in this part we'll have a look at some of the data critically and see if that can help us develop our understanding of the validity of the Blue Zones concept. So we'll look at a couple of them. We'll look at one in Sardinia, we'll look at one in China, and we'll talk about the issues arising from the way the data is collected and the conclusions that are drawn from it. So critical analysis. Okay, so that's taken from the first lecture, the quote from Poulain and Skemp. It's not quite true. The data was taken from published studies. Poulain and Skemp may have visited these places, but they did not develop the data, which I'm afraid isn't a particularly good start. Many blue zones are in mountainous regions. You'll just mention that in passing. Obviously, living in mountainous regions has an impact on a range of things: climate, nutrition, and lifestyle. How transferable that is that to wider populations? Again, we'll talk about that throughout the course of this lecture. Okay, so the Sardinian Blue Zone. Here's a paper looking at it from this particular area from 2004. So contrary to what Poulain had claimed about his expedition, this work was actually done by Poulain et al. Several years earlier. And as usual, there's a link through there to the actual information, and I will put the paper in the notes as well. So, identification of a geographical area characterised by extreme longevity in the Sardinian island. The paper notes that there's a high prevalence and low female-male ratio for validated centenarians observed in Sardinia, and these findings appear to be thus far unique to this island. Moreover, a specific region of the island is characterised by extremely exceptional male longevity. The figure seems striking, especially the male-female ratio. As I'm sure you know, women tend to live longer than men. If you look at the ratios here compared to other parts of the world, they are much closer together. But the question do start arising: what about sample size? We're comparing there to Sardinia and a province of Sardinia to whole countries. And we're only comparing to a fairly small number of countries as well. An open question acknowledged by these authors is how accurate are the data? We're talking about documentation going back 100 years or so. 100 years ago, everything was recorded by hand. It's a long time, and during the Second World War, Sardinia was much fought over, so many records may have been lost. So that's one issue there. Well, two issues there. One is sample size. The other is the validity of the historical records. In the main area, where exceptional longevity is concentrated, is located, identified in the central eastern part of the island, southeast of the Nuoro province, and covers this particular area identified here. They define something called an extreme longevity index, which is defined as the percentage of persons born in Sardinia between 1880 and 1902, I've got the wrong number in the notes there, who became centenarians. Okay, and they've mapped it out graphically there and showing this concentration in blue. I don't know where this is why Poulain had defined it as a blue zone, but it's in blue here. An extended blue zone was identified, is marked in light blue on the map. The authors also extend a restricted blue zone. In this limit area, 91 persons, 47 men and 44 women became centenarians of the 1800 who were born in the area between 1880 and 1900. And this is threefold the number of centenarians based on the Sardinia average. And the characteristic of this area is it's very mountainous. It doesn't really have it show it on this map here, but it is quite a mountainous area. So these are characteristics of the restricted blue zone. There's a word there, pastoralizia. It essentially means the rearing of sheep and shepherding, which is traditionally the main occupation of people who lived in these areas. The RBZ is a very small area, which isn't very similar geographically to much of Sardinia, or socially for that matter, or Italy, or the rest of the world. Even assuming these factors are important, how can other populations benefit from these insights is an open question about the Blue Zones concept. So continuing the characteristics, there's mountainous, until recently restricted access, limited immigration in both directions, and relatively high breeding, intermarriage and consanguinity. Now, this is where there's a close blood relationship, sometimes used to denote human inbreeding. Now, there's a general assumption in the paper here, mating with closely related persons causes significant... let me just go back. The paper assumes that this is a good thing. The wider assumption is that mating with closely related persons can cause significant genetic disease in offspring. Everyone carries rare recessive genes that, in the company of other genes of the same type, are capable of causing significant problems. So the paper sort of suggests it's a good thing, but the general consensus is that it's not a good thing. So that's an interesting issue, I think, here. So as I say, this assertion is contrary to our general understandings of these issues, which are normally negativity around consanguinity. I can't even pronounce that word, I beg your pardon. There's a group of people from Sardinia. So Pes et al. Also looked at this. Again, the paper's linked as usual. This later study took a more detailed approach to the population study across Sardinia. It found marked differences in extreme longevity across the whole 377 municipalities of the island, and particularly it identified a mountain inner area where the population of older subjects among male populations as one of the highest validated value worldwide, which is fair enough. Again, the map shows a longevity area identified by the study, which is similar to the areas identified by the previous study. I've read the paper for other geographical indications, and the map data was based on the category shown, which I'm not going to go through all of the factors. But we can, body robustness is one right at the bottom. People used to be sheep farmers. It's not a fantastically physically demanding area, but it does involve people working a long time, also at high altitude. Produced cheese. The diet was different. We're going to talk about how diet has changed in a moment. So a number of factors were assessed. So it's developing the evidence, and that's the sort of thing we're talking about. Whenever we think about a concept like blue zones, what we need to do is develop evidence to examine the concepts. The quality of the data of the population in each village, originally expressed through adjectives from very poor to good in previous studies, recorded into a variable based on 1 to 5. And this is the map that resulted from it. It's just an example of how the data was analysed. A relevant issue here is a nutritional transition, which is graphed at the bottom, which is shown in the image at the bottom. A nutritional transition is a shift in dietary consumption and energy expenditure that coincides with economic, demographical and epidemiological changes. So it's showing us going from proto-humans into humans who worked in farming, and then the so-called nutritional transition, and recently we've seen an identification of the fact that we need to exercise more, which is a comedy way of looking at this. This is a better way of looking at the nutrition transition, taken from a Harvard source, and it's affected almost all human populations. So have a look at it, have a read of that, pause the video, have a read of this. In terms of the study, the authors are referring to the transition between patterns 3 and 4. So the end of farming, based on the growth of agriculture, starting to see income rising and nutrition improving, and then we start to see the move to modern diets from traditional, if you will, peasant diets. Income continues to rise, individuals have access to an abundance of high-calorie foods, become less active, ultimately leading in a chronic sense to increase in obesity and obesity-related chronic diseases such as diabetes and heart diseases. And then, as we saw in the previous comedy thing on the slide before, people realise this and modify their behaviour in pattern 5. So it's quite a good map, I think, of nutritional transition. Well worth having to think about this in a number of contexts. As I mentioned, 100 years is a long time. The Italian lifestyle transition is assumed to have happened in the 1950s, perhaps a little later in Sardinia. Island populations tend to be a bit more insular. The authors note in the paper that data from early decades is not particularly reliable, which we've already talked about, which can have impact on the results and conclusions of such studies. And he also notes that fruit, veg, olive oil and fish are still very important in Sardinia. So if you look at the Italian equivalent of our Eat Well plate, Balance of Good Health, you see it contains quite a lot of oil and fish because it's a part of their diet, and these things, as we'll discuss later on, probably are meant to be practical tools. You have to be old to get old, which is again an issue here. It's sensible to assume that the characteristics of a person's early life had an impact of longevity and related factors. And again, evidence from the past may be unreliable. Now, there's a video there of people from Sardinia in the 1930s you might want to have a look at and see the very different lifestyle they live for people in the UK then probably, and certainly for people around the world now, which again links to the issue of how transferable are these models from blue zones to wider populations. Okay, so we'll move around the world to another proposed blue zone, this time in China. So this paper takes a much more critical approach to the issue of blue zones and identified some key issues of our understanding of populations involved. It's in the Ruga province, which is on the Yangtze River estuary in China, and he notes that, and I think that's a good quote, blue zones are mysterious regions that continue to attract research. Indices used to define longevity region have become more problematic, so that's looking at previous studies and saying, well, perhaps the methods we used to define longevity aren't as valid as people were suggesting at the time. That's not a criticism necessarily of the earlier papers, but knowledge does develop and we find better ways of doing things. So this is our longevity region. So China's a big country and it has over 200 million people aged over 60. 26% of the population in some areas, such as towns in this particular province, quite a lot higher. So using local statistical data, potential blue zone is identified in this region. It's mostly a rural area. In some of these areas, when the study was done in 2015, people over 60 years old made up more than 26% of the population, which is greater than 33% in some towns and regions, about 2 times the higher than the average value in the rest of China. Here's a characteristic which happens as countries develop, linking back to the population pyramid stuff we talked about a bit earlier on. As countries develop, their birth rate tends to fall. A low birth rate decreases the total population, therefore increasing the apparent rate of aging and proportion of centenarians. There are more higher proportion of older people in the population because fewer people are being born. And this was a factor the study attempted to control, but which wasn't necessarily controlled in previous studies. As we can see from this map, there are some quite wide fluctuations in birth rates across the study region. And China is an area which has seen considerable amounts of internal migration in the past few decades, which you didn't used to see. People moving from rural areas into the cities. And what we're seeing from rural areas is often out-migration of young people. This is another factor which increases the population, the proportion of older people in a particular population. The population structure must be considered to determine whether longevity is the primary reason that we're reading a higher degree of age in the research region. So in this case, they calculate average birth and migration data as shown here, and there's the calculation they used. I say lots of this information is available now, and more sophisticated calculations than we've done in the past are possible. Okay. So what do you mean by centenarian? It's a more complicated question than you might expect. To make their data more accurate, the authors designed a threshold for each age group. For example, a man and woman had to pass his or her 100th birthday before the data collection date to be collected as a centenarian. Reasonably enough. For this reason, data was not collected by year but by day. Otherwise, the error would be larger. And the cut-off day for the study was set as the last day of the year, 31st of December. One of the things they found was that half of the centenarians died in the winter, which is not very surprising. And the number of centenarians overall was very small, so the number of centenarians in winter was much lower than in the summer, which again, when you have small numbers and you compare to larger populations, can grossly distort conclusions. So in fact, a couple of things here, which we'll talk about in a second. So here we are. So these were the measures used: CI percentage and LI percentage. They were considered even more valid than just the proportion of centenarians in the general population. Other studies have suggested these two indicators are more useful for measuring longevity in regions with high degree of aging, and that's important. Research proceeds by people developing ideas which are then tested by other people. So these studies looked at previous studies, and studies after this have continued to develop our understanding. Yeah, if you look at these maps, you'll see they do change quite a lot. The average fluctuation of the proportion of centenarians is much higher than those from nonagenarians, that is to say people in age between 90 and 100. This again reflects the fact that there are far fewer centenarians than nonagenarians, which again creates uncertainty in the data. Another issue found was the centenarian ratio in some towns changed significantly from year to year. This is probably associated with a small number of centenarians. Again, a small change in the absolute numbers can have disproportionate effects on the data. The authors also commented that the ratio of centenarians measured over a short period of time cannot represent the degree of longevity in a small region. A longer period of data collection analysis is essential. As such, better indicators were needed, which of course is always the case. More data is always better. So how they did this, so this is a little bit of technicalities of how they did this. The authors turned to something which is grandly called univariate local Moran spatial analysis. This is a sophisticated geographical information tool, the details of which are beyond the scope of this module. See the paper if you're interested. Basically what he did was identify local clusters, adjacent areas with similar values, and outliers, areas that are more distinct from their neighbours. This mapping approach is becoming very important. Again, we can use statistical tools and we can link through to maps and do all sorts of technical analysis now, which 10 years ago would have been very difficult to do. We can potentially do this now ourselves. Yeah, so the conclusions are probably more important than the tools they used. Okay, so 3 different categories were identified using the Moran technique as described here. They were used to test the null hypothesis that longevity was not associated with spatial clustering in a statistically significant way, done by estimating the p-values. We can talk about these in semester 1. So based on the null hypothesis, you should be able to specify what the alternative hypothesis was. So have a think about that. The authors, based on this mapping data, we conclude there was some weak evidence of a longevity zone in the rural centre of the region, identified by the red indications here on the maps. These are the conclusions. Again, more data required. I'm not going to go through the data. You can read about this yourself. But he noticed that people easily live to 90 to 99. But as we noted earlier on, the number of centenarians is very significantly lower and a quite small number, and more data is required. Always more data is required. Okay, so we looked at, in the first lecture, we looked at the claims made by Blue Zones, and we looked at a couple of studies which have looked in Blue Zones in more scientific detail, including studies done after the original studies were done. So some issues arise. These are issues arising around the identification of blue zones, which are not as simple as the popular conception suggests. Sample size are very small and poor quality historical data, and can we consistently identify what that means, are key issues here, which aren't addressed in the popular conception. And then there's the issue of generalisability, which is really important. Great blue zones, people live a long time. How can we make those recommendations? How can we use those recommendations to develop guidance for people who don't live in blue zones? Because we can't all live up a mountain, that's very clear. So generalisability is defined there, the extent to which findings of a study can be applicable to other settings. sometimes called external validity. It requires a judgment of whether findings of a study are applicable to a wider group. It does seem like there's some real effects we're seeing, for example, the Sardinian population, but how many of us could adopt such a lifestyle? Who would want to? The Blue Zone recommendations are in many cases probably good advice, but their linkage to these populations and the generalisability of the benefits of these lifestyle choices are, I would suggest, a long way from being established, though you may feel free to disagree with me in the discussion, but make your disagreement evidence-based. Okay, that completes that. Thanks for listening.